Hey there guys, I'm finally back from my many month-long hiatus and will hopefully be back to making more videos a lot more consistently now. I was actually working on a different wolf completely for my comeback here, but then the Game Awards happened and I had to reveal a sequel to one of my all-time favorite games, so needless to say, plans had to change a bit. So for this video, I will be making Amaterasu from Okami. I actually made her before as one of my very first projects ever, so it will be cool to be able to compare how much I've grown as a felter in the 3 years since the last time I made her. I absolutely adore how she turned out this time around, and maybe if there's enough interest I could look into making the other brush gods in the future. Well, without further ado, let's get right into it. First things first, I take a giant clump of core wool. I roll it up into a little ball and then wrap it in yarn. Wrapping the wool in yarn is important because it kind of compacts it and makes it a lot easier to work with right off the bat. Otherwise, I'd be spending a ton of time trying to felt the wool down just to get it to the same point. Now I just keep adding wool to the ball to build up the rough shape of the body. You don't want the body to be too chunky yet because you have to keep in mind that eventually you'll have to add legs and fur to it later, which will all contribute to the thickness. At this point, I add the main wire for the body. I don't like to start with wire and felt around it because it usually ends in me breaking a lot of needles, and you don't really want that. For the main body support, it's good to use a really thick wire and have it going all throughout the body and connecting to the tail, kind of like a real spine. Having it go through the body like this really helps with posing and to keep the whole thing stable. All that exposed wire does make things a bit annoying when you're moving everything around so much, and for this particular doggo, I end up snipping it and adding the tail later. Luckily in this case, doing that didn't affect the stability too much, and I was able to get away with it. That's not the case all the time. I've also added the head and neck to the body at this point. I'm starting with a small ball here because I have a bad habit of making things way bigger than they're supposed to be, and then having to adjust the rest of it to compensate, which results in a creature far bigger than I ever wanted. So to prevent that, start small and attach it to the body early so that you can add little bits at a time and keep the size within a reasonable range. Once the face has its shape to it, I start to add the details. Luckily, Ammy doesn't have the most complex features in the world, so it's just a couple of dots and a line I need to add. Now I move on to the ears, which are basically just triangles, making my life super easy for this part. After I attach them, I add the little ridges to them by rolling up a little bit of wool and felting it on directly. And that's the head done for now. Nice and simple. For the legs, I start with 4 long noodles. Once those are felted, I poke holes through them and try my best to shove a wire into each of them. This is also where I decided to snip the tail and re-added a new longer wire, which will go up through where one of the legs goes and out the tail end. I'm doing it this way because the entire model is going to be supported by one single paw with the pose I decided to go with. And to get that to work with the weight of the rest of the body, you need a very strong wire going through the whole body. I purposefully leave extra wire at the bottom of the paw so that I can feed it through the base later. I also put a little bit of glue on the wire so that the leg is set in place and isn't constantly sliding around it. Now that I have the wire inside the legs, I carefully felt around it to shape them. In theory, the best way to do this is to go slowly and carefully, but I don't know what that means and continue to felt aggressively like I always do. Yes, I did break multiple needles while doing this, and I have nobody to blame but myself. Now I have to go through the absolutely miserable task of felting 16 tiny claws to add to the paws. After I felt them onto each of the toes, I go back over top of them with more white wool to reshape the toe again, because the toe will more than likely deform a bit when you're felting on the claw. I like to wait to sculpt out the thighs and shoulders until after I attach them to the body. Doing that gives me a better idea of how big certain parts should be and makes things a bit more cohesive this way. So I completely forgot to film me putting her onto the base, my bad. So as you can see, she has a base now. Normally I wait until the very end to put the base on, but in this case it made adding the fur a lot easier. To make the fur here, I use long clumps of wool roving. This part can be kind of tricky, but essentially you go in layers starting at the very bottom layer first. In this case, that would be the base of the neck for her mane. I felt halfway down the roving to start with, and then fold it in the direction that it's supposed to be. This can get very thick very quickly if you're not careful, so I will be spacing out the layers just a bit. Though spacing them too much will lead to bald spots, so you gotta kind of find that perfect medium. I just want to pop in here and remind everyone that I do have a Patreon. I am just a single lonely bug putting these sculptures and videos together, so any amount of support helps me to make more content for you all to enjoy. On here I post work in progresses, tutorials, and I have lots of exclusive content I don't post anywhere else. As an added bonus, your name will also be added to the credits of all my videos as well. Anyways, back to the video. She is now looking wonderfully floofy, but desperately needs a grooming. This part is still a big challenge for me, so I just kind of go for it, little by little. Always take off small bits at a time because you can always remove more later if you need to, but you can't put it back on if you cut off too much. on to the tail. I once again snip off the tail wire because I can never follow my own advice, but also because it's way easier to do details when you can freely move it around. Making this look good isn't too important since it will be covered up by thick strands of fur soon, so don't worry about it. Like with the mane, I start at the very tip of the tail and work down. My first attempt at the tail ended up way too thick, so I'm going to fix that by using thinner strands and not folding the piece in half. For this part, I want to keep the chunks nice and distinct as a stylistic choice. To keep the tail from getting messed up as I work with it, I spritz the fur with this spray glue. You really only need a little bit for this part. If you use too much, the whole thing will look kind of plasticky and it'll lose that nice soft look. Now that I got the chunks where I want them and they have a decent hold to them, I then trim and bend the fluff to get it to the right shape. I didn't need to do much with it since it just kind of looked good right away. To make the swirls in her fur, I took a chunk of the roving and rolled up the end to the size I wanted it to be. I then lightly felted the swirl mark right into it, just enough for it to hold together. I also spray these with glue so that they don't come apart on me. Once they're all done, I felt them into their appropriate spots and give it another couple sprays to keep it all together. To finish up the felting part with this lady, I go over her legs with the various swirls and fluffy bits she has on them. She now looks a bit like how the regular townsfolk in the game see her, so let's add a bit of godly magic to this wolf. I was really torn on how to go about adding her markings. I was stuck between chalk pastels or paint. After testing it out on a scrap piece of wool, the pastels were all way too light when I put them on, but the paint just looked flat out bad, so pastels it is. I still wish the black on the tip of her tail was more black than it was gray, but it was the best I could do. With a paintbrush, I added in the bits of black chalk to the outlines of all of her swirls and some of the fluff. I actually really liked the subtle look it gave for these parts in the end. Now comes the most stressful part of the whole project, her red markings. I don't think I breathed once during this whole process. I'm surprised I even survived it, to be honest. I absolutely could not mess this part up, because it would be almost impossible for me to fix without cutting that part out and starting over. You could probably tell how focused I was, because she isn't even in frame for most of this. But I did end up surviving, and Amaterasu herself is now complete. To make her divine instrument, I wanted it to be a different texture from the rest of her, so I used XPS foam for this. For the details, I attempted to carve them out into the foam directly, but that didn't really work out super well, so I decided to cut out craft foam in the right shapes and glue them on top. I honestly like this better anyway because it gave a lot more depth to the weapon. I did, however, carve the squiggles in. Now it's time to add the fire to the reflector. This part was really simple. I just took clumps of orange roving and hot glued them to the shield. I originally intended to have the fire glow with a strand of LED lights. I had it all done and in place, but when I went to add on the fire, it just didn't give the effect I wanted, so I scrapped the idea. I'm so disappointed it didn't work because I wanted to be extra in some way with this. And that's her weapon done. Now I just glue it in place on her back and move on to making the base look nice. In the game, when Amaterasu runs, she leaves behind these dust clouds and flowers sprout up at her feet, so I definitely wanted to emulate that here. Similarly to the fur, I fell to the swirls into one big clump until I got something I was happy with. After gluing that in place at her feet, I cut out pieces of grass and the flowers from felt sheets and glued those in place as well. This glorious doggo is now finished.